Ben Zimmer, welcome to the podcast. Hi.
Hi there.
It's so great to be here with you. You are
Yeah,
famous, I guess.
I
One
don't know
could
about
say.
that.
Yeah. So to start, I suppose, why don't you explain why I said that you're famous? Who are you? What do you do? What's your contribution currently to the world, and why are you doing it?
Who am I? I often ask myself the same question. No, I don't know. I like to describe myself as a linguist, lexicographer, and all-around word nut. Um, I'm a language columnist. For 10 plus years now, I've been writing a weekly column for the Wall Street Journal about words in the news and where they come from. The column's called Word on the Street. I contribute to various other places too, writing about language and words. And I wear various other hats, all on a kind of various wordy things that I do. So, for instance, I'm chair of the New Words Committee for the American Dialect Society, and in that capacity, I get to oversee the Word of the Year selection process. Always a lot of fun. Also, as part of that, I'm part of a group that does a quarterly feature for the journal American Speech, the Journal of the American Dialect Society, and that feature is called Among the New Words. And so that's another thing that that I enjoy doing. And yeah, various other things. These days, I'm involved with the Scripps National Spelling Bee. They brought me on to work on vocabulary questions, where the kids are actually they're asked the meat about the meanings of words, not just the spelling. So yeah, I guess I wear many hats. But yeah, I just often just try to be at the intersection of lots of different wordy pursuits, let's say.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yes, so you did a great job, always do a great job every year of doing this Word of the Year ceremony at the Linguistic Society of America's annual meeting, but like subset of that, the American Dialect Society's Word of the Year situation, where a bunch of linguists lobby and fight nicely sometimes over what
Usually nicely, yeah.
usually nicely over what the word of the year should be. So since this is going to be framed by words, this whole discussion, which is a bit of
Yes.
a controversial thing for the linguistics community to even acknowledge that words exist in stuff. I'm gonna, if you don't know, if this doesn't work out, I'll cut the entire thing out. No one will ever know. But I'm going to read this quote, and I want to see if you can know where it comes from. And if you do know where it comes from, then it will serve as a great paratext for the entire interview to come. Okay, so
Okay.
all right, so okay, words! Exclamation point. Mere words! Exclamation point. How terrible they were! Exclamation point. How clear and vivid and cruel! Exclamation point. One could not escape from them, and yet what a subtle magic there was in them! Exclamation point. They seemed to be able to give a plastic form to formless things, and to have a music of their own as sweet as that of viol or of flute. Mere words! Exclamation point. Was there anything so real as words? Question mark. Do you
Well,
know where this is from?
it's definitely literary.
Yes.
It sounds familiar.
I can give you a hint.
Okay, give me a hint.
Okay, hint is art and Oscar Wilde.
Oh, Picture of Dorian Gray.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Beautiful. Have you read it?
You know what? I read it a long time ago, and my son recently read it for his high school English class.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's
So,
good, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So
yeah,
that
good
that
stuff.
for me is a great quote, but I can't say it to a lot of linguists because they don't care about words. But you do, which is great. So let's start there. Let's define some things.
But
Um, yeah.
yeah, just the part I liked about that quote is that they give a what was it? They give a plastic form to
They give a
formless
plastic
things.
form to formless things. I like it,
That's
right? Because
terrific.
what is
Yeah,
plastic, right? A plastic form to formless things. That's kind of
yeah,
cool.
I like that.
I
Yeah.
know, right? He's fun. So yeah, so you did this, you did this interview a few years ago for the Slovenian Linguistics Journal, and you kind of talked about your sort of journey from, I guess, like more formal linguistics, structural linguistics in college to more cultural and
Hmm.
anthropological linguistics in grad school. And I guess let's start there. Like, what is a word to you? What is language to you? Do you see it as a structuralist? Do you approach it like a structuralist, like Saussure, like Bloomfield, or are you more Bakhtin and like one of the heteroglossia fans? What is
Um,
and feel free to
I think
define what is
I
language to
think you I think you can be all of those things. I
you?
don't
Okay.
think you have to limit yourself to any one particular theoretical approach. Um, and you know, I did start in the sort of as a linguistics major undergrad at Yale, and studying sort of formal linguistics. But by the end of that experience, I was already being drawn over into linguistic anthropology over in the anthropology department, um, uh, working with a professor there, Joe Arrington, who ended up sort of being my undergraduate advisor. It ended up also being why I ended up doing field work in Indonesia, and sort of taking Indonesian, the national language, and then studying a regional language called Sundanese, which I studied in graduate school. Um, and so, yeah, I mean that was sort of my journey. I ended up at University of Chicago for linguistic anthropology and soaking up all of these different theoretical approaches and understanding what was that structuralist approach that Saussure and then Bloomfield ended up bringing to American linguistics. But then, yeah, being exposed to all of these other theoretical traditions that you could sort of put into your toolbox, into your repertoire. And that could be literary theory, or it could be Bakhtin, for instance, who I was very much drawn to. And the thing that perhaps intrigued me the most about Bakhtin, and just reading, there was Rabelais in his world, and then there was the great collection of essays on the dialogic imagination. This idea of heteroglossia, that instead of just sort of thinking of language as this formal system, you could think of it as all of these sort of multiple voicings, and it's sort of shot through with it, and to pick apart any stretch of language use, you have to understand all of these things at once, and from the perspective of the speaker or writer of the language, but then everything involving sort of all of the context of history and politics and so forth. And that excited me a lot, to sort of think of it as this sort of vibrant, uh, you know, system that was not simply just sort of a closed formal loop or anything like that, but that could really encompass the whole world, basically. And in any given utterance or any given, stretch of language. Um, and so you can even say that about the lowly word. And I mean, that's kind of what has driven my writing, at least, when I look at a particular word or phrase. I'm not going to get into, any nitpicky argument about what constitutes a word, because that's pointless as far as I'm concerned. Um, my training in lexicography has, led me to appreciate, what constitutes a lexical item, which is at least a little bit easier to pinpoint than the nebulous concept of the word. Um, but yeah, I know what I do these days, in terms of my language column for the Wall Street Journal and writing elsewhere. I tend to think of as a kind of narrative lexicography, where you can talk about the life of a word or phrase, and from the earliest known use to the present day, and all the different cultural worlds that it may run through. And you tell this very sort of interesting story that necessitates dipping into all of these things like history and politics and everything, to understand the context of use, and what it means to people, why it's significant. Thinking about it, meta-linguistically, perhaps, when it becomes something that rises to salience, or to the people's consciousness of a particular word, especially if it's controversial in some way. It might be controversial because it's politically charged in a certain way in our discourse, or even just because people have certain peeves about the way language works. But a lot of language writing focuses on those peeves. I try to, understand the peeves without being too focused on those, because as far as I'm concerned, every word in a language, every lexical item, whatever you want to call it, in a language, can open up a whole story, a whole narrative that allows you to, again, sort of think about various intersecting cultural worlds. So even though I'm long removed from my graduate school days at University of Chicago, I still think back about some of those, theoretical approaches that I was lucky to really get a grounding in They may not like directly inform things I write. I'm not, citing Bakhtin in my Wall Street Journal column. Although maybe I should.
You should,
but
yeah.
but it's there in the background. It's always informing, the way that I write, the way that I think about language.
Yeah. What I like about people like Bakhtin is that they, I think, more so are sympathetic to the idea that we are actually like autonomous agents over language. We
Right?
have power over how it
Hmm.
changes and what it means, rather than
Hmm.
like we are somehow like indoctrinated into, I mean, we are in some ways, like it's hard to play with syntax in ways that actually end up changing things. But like actually we have a lot of power and we're changing
Yeah,
language all the time and it's
absolutely.
shifting and
Agency.
moving.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
there's so
great.
much, I know. And it's very political, as you
Absolutely.
said,
Yeah.
right? So language change, right? Words change all the time. Semantic change is one of my favorite little areas of how things work and what it reveals about the world. So in your extensive work on language change and the shifting of lexical items, what have you found to be true about that? Like what makes a word sustainable? What types of things tend to make a word change? What types of things make language change? What does that say about our world and our society?
Yeah.
Slang is big. Yeah. Yeah.
Right, right. Yeah, no, it's interesting because I think about these issues a lot in both the short term and the long term. And so obviously with taking over the quarterly feature Among the New Words, which is something that, got started back in the 1940s by Dwight Bollinger
Mhm.
for American speech, the idea was like, let's try to sort of snap these things up as they're kind of rising to prominence in the language or in the lexicon. Um, uh, Before the dictionaries are even really working on them. These days, the major dictionary publishers do a better job of keeping up with the new words coming in. But yeah, so it's interesting to be sort of thinking about the genesis of certain lexical items and how they um, can sort of bubble up from a particular subculture, let's say, before they go mainstream. Thinking about thinking about the spread of those things, and of course, these days it's often mediated by all sorts of social media and so forth in terms of how things circulate. But then also thinking very long term, because very often I'm thinking about words that are uh, centuries old, which are now getting some sort of new spin based on sort of new context, basically. So what's fascinating to me is, yeah, I mean, despite the fact that here in the 21st century we are looking at what's the effect of TikTok or whatever on the way that language forms can spread very quickly, can become global phenomena in a very short period of time. Um, the things that sort of make uh, lexical items successful, that sort of like give them staying power, are very often the things that have always kind of ruled the lexicon. And so uh, you know uh, Alan Metcalf, who the longtime executive secretary of the American Dialect Society, who preceded me as in terms of running the uh, the whole Word of the Year uh, festivities. I learned a lot from him, and he has a great book called Predicting New Words, where he tries to sort of like give the criteria for what he thinks um, are lead to a new word success in the lexicon. And he looks at all sorts of different factors, like basically words have to be sort of memorable in a certain way. He had a mnemonic, which I'm trying to remember now. It's the fudge factors, FUDGE. And so F was frequency of use, U is unobtrusiveness, D is diversity of users and situations, G is generation of other forms and meanings, and E is endurance of the concept. So that's a handy little guide that really can tell you a lot about about what works and what doesn't work. And something like generation of other forms and meanings is a key one, because if something is ends up sort of kind of too limited in terms of its scope, uh, then that it may be a particular technical word that might fit a jargon of a particular, say, scientific community and so forth. But in terms of a wider pickup, you kind of need the ability to kind of spread semantically and also spread morphologically. And so whether that's, creating various kind of lexical spin-offs, and so you take any recent example and you look at let's say rizz, just off the top of my head, because that's been such a successful one that people have talked about recently, and you could see the kind of the success of something that like that requires being able to apply that to many different contexts, but then also to be able to take this concept of rizz, which again is often understood as a clipping of charisma, even though, as we learned when we wrote about this for Among the New Words in American Speech, the originator of this term, the streamer Kai Cenat, says that he didn't actually take it from the word charisma, but that's become sort of the popular explanation for where it comes from. But I mean, we talked about it for the word of the year over the course of a couple of years, because it first hit it big, I guess, in 2022, but then in 2023, you could see this already kind of successful word became really successful. And why was that? And you could look at again, sort of the kind of the cultural pickup in various new places and new forms. And so, rizz turning into a verb, for instance, or to rizz up and that sort of thing.
Yeah, really
Showed,
rizzed. Yeah.
right. And something about again, yeah, the like what Alan Metcalf would call sort of the diversity of users and situations, the way that it could sort of like spread around that way, made it, an obvious success story. And so obviously most of the time you don't have that kind of magic formula working, and things can just fade away. So it is interesting to see what stands the test of time, what can enter dictionaries, and the word rizz is already in some of the major dictionaries, even though it's very new, because the lexicographers know, well, yep, this is one that we need to pay attention to. So yeah, I mean, all of that goes into my understanding of language change, semantic change on the lexical level. Again, I'm not talking at all about other types of change that linguists look at. Obviously, if you're getting into whatever phonological change or syntactic change and that sort of thing, I do focus on the word unit and sort of see things through that lens, which in some ways may be limiting and in some ways kind of plays into folk understandings of the way that language works. Obviously, the people who do not have training in linguistics often just simply think of language as a bunch of words strung together, and once you start taking linguistics, you recognize all the different sort of levels to it. So I often think of the work that I do as playing into a lexicocentric ideology, but I try to be aware of that and also try to smuggle in some other linguistics along the way when, for instance, phonology and morphology and that sort of thing, or syntax is relevant to what I'm talking about. Then I'll try to bring that in a way that is still accessible to a general audience.
Right. I want to ask about, there's a lot of, I think, well, at least this year at the Word of the Year ceremony, and I think probably believe every year, there's a lot of discussion of like where these words are coming from and how
Right.
they get popular and from what community
Right.
they come from. A lot of our quote unquote slang words originate from African American English. And so like, words like slay and spill the tea and expressions like that, they have this longer process, one could say, of kind of getting into a place where they're in
Yep.
the like more mainstream white lexicon, as opposed to the lesser mainstream lexicon of people of more marginalized identities. And I think, yeah, I wanted to get your thoughts on sort of like what do we do with that to kind of realize that a lot of our words that are kind of like on pitch are originally come from communities that maybe we're not a part of. This year, cunty was on the line or on the line, and people were like, "This is not a word that comes from the community of most people, the majority, maybe not anyone in this room. And
Right.
there's a discussion of that. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's something that we always have to sort of be aware again of the cultural roots of a lot of what we consider new
Yeah.
has a history which may not be legible to people who sort of think of it as, oh, this is the latest Gen Z slang.
Right.
And in fact, you know, this supposed Gen Z slang is simply, you know, various kinds of lexical appropriations, let's say, of that may come from African American English, sometimes specifically subculture like, you know, drag culture, where we're talking about sort of like, you know, the pioneers are very often, you know, trans African Americans. And these are marginalized communities that don't get the credit for a lot of the sort of cultural innovation and linguistic innovation necessarily, unless there are folks who are there to say, hey, let's, you know, let's look at where this language is actually coming from. Why does it get this particular, you know, mainstream pickup where mainstream basically gets coded as, you know, that's, you know, white, you know,
Yeah.
basically, or, you know,
Yeah.
young white people
White or
discover it.
cis or
Yeah,
straight. I mean, there's a
exactly.
lot like at play of
Exactly.
words. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So I think there's a greater awareness and sensitivity to all of that. And my concern with word of the year and that sort of thing is that at times we can run the risk of treating these things too glibly simply because we're like, hey, here are the nominations for word of the year,
Yeah.
and this is what they mean, and we might, you know, say a little bit about where they come from, but we need to sort of really be giving that kind of rich cultural history for all of these terms. And again, that's what we try to do with Among the New Words, where, you know, we have installments where we just go through the nominations, the nominees for the various categories in Word of the Year, and we do both a kind of a discursive treatment of a, you know, paragraph or two talking about each of these things, and then we do a full kind of historical lexicographical treatment as the supplemental material, which you will find online for the online version of the journal, where we're giving this kind of OED style, you know, citational evidence
That's
going back
Oxford
to the
English Dictionary.
yes,
Dictionary. Yeah.
Oxford
Yeah.
English Dictionary. Yes,
Yeah.
that's right. Oxford English Dictionary being this sort of historical approach in historical lexicography, where you know, you define the word, define its various senses, but then try to give a full accounting based on citational evidence of the earliest known use through its various incarnations,
Yeah.
and even for words and phrases and other items, because we treat other things like emoji, for instance, which are kind of crazy to treat lexicographically. Um, with all of these things, you can build a kind of historical record that you tries to be as accurate as possible. But you know, there are various limitations even with that. So you know, for what we call slang and forms of that more informal colloquial nature, obviously it can exist in oral use and spoken use long before it gets written down. There are ways to kind of try to uh, fill out that picture a little better. And these days, again, with new social media, that is less of a concern because people are, first of all, you know, recording themselves using things a lot more now and sharing them with the world, whether it's on, you know, TikTok or YouTube or whatever. But also what is the text that is being generated, even when it's written text, typed text, um, is very much more sort of shot through with you know, things that we would might have previously considered not appropriate for you know, standard written English or something like that. So we have so much at our disposal now in order to be able to track these things. It still requires work, though. It still requires work to really like try to paint an accurate picture of like what are the cultural worlds that generate these new forms, and how do they cross over in various ways? And so one thing that I think that what we're trying to accomplish, at least in this sort of fuller accounting in the among the new words um, uh, feature, is to combat the various types of erasure that we see going on, where it could be again African American culture or other marginalized sources that do not get the kind of the credit that they deserve in terms of where this innovation is coming from and why it becomes appealing. And again, there are various reasons for why you could say that these particular firms get the kind of the cultural pickup that they do, the why certain things seem cool enough to be something that you'd want to incorporate if you're a young person looking for the types of language that might indicate a kind of in-group identity, as
Covert
sociolinguists like to think about
prestige,
it.
one would say. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Or sometimes an anti-prestige becomes the new prestige.
Yeah.
That's the sort of like the anti-language approach when we sort of think about like things that are, actually oppositional to standard language are the things that
Yeah.
have the most appeal at times. And then, as of course, when things do go mainstream and start entering dictionaries and get used by, older folk and, people on TV or whatever, that signals kind of the death of that cultural cachet because the wrong people are using it now. So,
Right.
there can be a whole kind of life cycle to these things that can be traced, and that's fascinating too to see again like what through that whole process might stick around, or again, typically these things have a shorter shelf life.
Right. Yeah. I want to say like with, you're saying like emojis and stuff. I feel like it's so interesting. It's like, why not though? It's a
Right.
semiotic resource. Like it's a sign,
Exactly.
to this year, the watermelon emoji being
Hmm.
sort of this signal for the Palestinian flag because it has the same colors. And because people are finding that when you have the Palestinian flag on things, you get taken down sometimes
Yeah.
by Instagram. So using that to kind of like,
Yeah.
again, index a certain political allegiance. I think that's like, yeah,
That's a great example, and in fact, it won the category for political word of the year. I'm putting word
yeah,
in
yeah, yeah,
quotation marks.
absolutely. Yeah.
In past years, for the word of the year, we've had a special category for emoji. We didn't do that this time, just because as the nominations came in, there didn't seem to be a whole lot there that to sort of like fill out a category of emoji that we hadn't already considered that in past years
Right.
but watermelon emoji, that was extremely prominent, and one that was again kind of tells a fascinating story in terms of culture and politics and history.
Yeah.
And so in fact, we're doing a special themed installment of Among the New Words uh coming up. It's for the I guess it will be the May 2024 issue of American Speech that focuses on algospeak. And
Yeah.
so algospeak is this term that's come up for the various kind of often kind of evasive maneuvers that have to be made in order to outwit the algorithms and other ways um, that basically speech can or language can become dangerous politically sometimes, or it can just simply be something where you want to avoid people searching for uh, a particular use of, again, it could be a lexical item or it could even be an emoji.
Yeah, I mean,
uh,
should we get
so yeah,
specific? I mean, like I'll go speak, I
yeah,
think largely came about because people were trying to talk about sex and Instagram was saying, don't say
right,
porn. So people
right,
said corn and then started using the
right,
corn
corn,
emoji.
exactly.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
a great
Yeah.
example. And um so yeah, I mean, this is we dig into all of this stuff with the help of Kendra Calhoun and Alexia Fawcett, who have become kind of the experts on algo speak. They did a great presentation at the LSA and now have an article out that kind of comes out of their research.
Yeah.
And we brought them on board to sort of help us out and try to understand algo speak and dig into some of these things. So yeah. So very often, again, it's sort of filters that are placed on various platforms, which then have to be evaded
Yeah.
in various clever ways. Those clever,
Restrictions. Yeah.
yes, right. And those clever evasive maneuvers are ones that again have been used historically in various ways, whether people finding different ways to take a form and uh, change it subtly, perhaps just changing a letter like porn to corn, or using various other techniques in order to sort of get around these things. So the watermelon emoji is interesting, an interesting example of that because again, long before emoji existed, the watermelon itself was this kind of icon going back to the 1960s for Palestinians. There's a history of watermelon in Levantine cuisine, but then at a time when the Palestinian flag was banned by the Israeli government, then using this as a kind of a stand-in, which, as it happens, has these similar colors, that sort of carried over into online usage, with the watermelon emoji becoming this new symbol of solidarity. And so, yeah, I mean, again, just something like that where the emoji as a particular kind of signifier, and thinking of the semiotics of that, and thinking of all that just can be wrapped up in just somebody using that particular emoji, making that choice. And again, sort of getting back to sort of the agency, it is about what you're choosing to put out there in the world. Why this rather than something else that you could do? And sort of thinking about those individual choices and what goes into that. And yeah, just as much for emoji as any other bit of our sort of semiotic landscape.
Yeah, I mean, not to belabor the point, but like semiotic landscape. I mean, go back historically to like how gay people would signal to. I mean, like ear piercing, like piercing one ear versus two. Like semiotics goes like so far back in
Or
terms of like how.
handkerchiefs, yeah,
Yeah,
whatever.
for sure. Like what are we signaling and how are we signaling it?
Right.
And is it conscious and is it a choice? And it's not a word, but it's still something that indexes something. It's a signifier.
Exactly.
So we've been like going here to the political thing, but you are so often called upon by the news to speak about politics. And I find this really fascinating because plenty of linguists can speak about the political nature of their research. Like this is not new, but yet you're on CNN to discuss impeachment hearings or Kavanaugh being what he is, or things of that nature. And you gave this talk in 2017 at the LSA meeting called Traveling Among the New Words, Lexical Adventures in the Digital Age, in which you kind of went on this whole thing of like how certain words that are used in these political contexts can be then recontextualized, resignified. So nasty woman is said by Trump, and then suddenly people reappropriate that and take that and they say, no, I'm reclaiming that like I'm a nasty woman. Binders full of women. I hadn't heard that one in a long time. I was
That
like,
takes you
binders full
back.
of
Yeah.
women.
Wow. Yeah.
I haven't heard that in forever. I mean, like, I'm gonna have to put like the explicit button on this episode, but like when Samantha Bee called Ivanka Trump a feckless cunt, like that was a moment, right? Like, so I don't know why are first off, like why do you think you're so often called upon to really speak about politics? But then what is going on here? Like I was kind of fascinated as to why you were on CNN talking about in both impeachment hearings and Kavanaugh in terms of like why congressmen are yelling, like, or well, just Congress people in general, but it was men yelling at the hearings. I mean, Lindsey Graham
Right.
was doing this whole histrionic thing of like, this is not a job interview, this is hell. Like, well, you did sexually assault someone, so lol. But
Yeah.
yeah, the political nature of language when it's used, not just what it is. Yeah.
Right. Well, yeah. It's interesting. I've tried, I tried to, as I became kind of a language commentator, I often tried to think about the politics of language. Again, even in my graduate work
Yeah.
and doing work on, Indonesian and Sundanese language, very, very often I was talking about the politics of language. I wrote a whole thesis about kind of subversive wordplay, which which could be used in Indonesia during the New Order regime, to kind of subvert the power of Suharto in that era. so like the politics of language was always something that fascinated me.
Yeah.
And as I kind of tried to develop a voice as um, as a language commentator, I realized that uh, what what people often want to hear about is words and phrases and linguistic aspects that are politically salient over, a particular issue that might be going on. Again, it could be Supreme Court hearings. It could be again, the things that come up in campaigning and other things. And so um, certainly during the Trump era, this kept me very busy, and I did a lot for The Atlantic and Politico. I'm doing less of that these days, but certainly the Trump era lent itself very well to that kind of discussion. Coming in right away with alternative facts and just sort of taking it from there. Yeah,
Vaguely.
and
Yeah.
yeah.
Just
I mean,
all the debates. I mean, the debates are
exactly,
right.
exactly,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, exactly, yeah. So. Uh, Yeah, I guess that when I'm sort of called upon to talk about these things, again, I'm trying to again sort of try to contextualize things. Why these particular, again, linguistic or lexical aspects might sort of rise to something that we want to obsess over and talk about on news networks and so forth. And so, yeah, very often we're talking about particular politically charged words. These days, we could be talking about ceasefire, for instance, as an example of a politically charged word, and certainly one that came up in our word of the year discussions, where there's a, there's again a kind of a meta-linguistic discourse that goes around these kind of key terms that enter our political awareness, and again sort of get shot through with these voicings, again, to go back to Bakhtin, and the way that kind of recontextualization and then recontextualization can happen so quickly. You were talking about the nasty woman phenomenon, and on the other side of that equation in 2016, of course, we had the basket of deplorables, where Hillary used that term, and then within hours you've got the MAGA types with their deplorable T-shirts and so forth.
As they should.
So,
Yeah.
right, but I mean, it's this type of thing where now that whole process is just accelerated to the degree that, again, it can happen just in the space of hours, where something becomes kind of emblematized, let's say. Another great example of that, of course, is the is sorry, I just need to take some water, so if we can
No, you're good. I was going to say commodified as well. I mean, the second that nasty woman gets said, suddenly it's on t-shirts and hoodies. And why not?
sorry. Okay, we can pick up again now that
Yeah,
my
yeah.
my
What was
voice
your,
has come back.
yeah,
Okay,
you were
so
getting an example of something.
yeah. Um so I mean, a fascinating example of that would be the let's go Brandon phenomenon again. So
Oh,
so
yeah.
where the story there is that there is this NASCAR race, and an NBC reporter, she was talking to the winner of the race, who happened to be named Brandon. There were chants of "fuck you, Biden" going on, which she misheard as "let's go Brandon," thinking that they were rooting on the winner of that race. That then became this sort of figure of play, where "let's go Brandon" ended up becoming this sort of euphemized version of like an anti-Biden sentiment, which then gets recontextualized again by the pro-Biden forces, and then we get all of these wonderful spin-offs like Dark Brandon, where you get images of Joe Biden with lasers shooting out of his eyes, which again, it's sort of taking MAGA imagery and reclaiming it in this new way, and sort of seeing that bouncing back and forth like that, where for you to understand where even like, Joe Biden, uses this dark Brandon imagery in his social media now to even sort of understand all the layers that go into that, and into something like that, where again, it's these voicings and sort of shooting it back and forth across various types of ideological divides. Um,
Yeah.
so much of our political discourse is like that now, where to unpack it, it requires a lot of work, and it requires like sort of like stepping back and thinking, okay, so how did this emerge? How did it get picked up by Group A? How did Group B react to that? How did it sort of through memes or what have you, perhaps develop layers of irony that you have to sort of figure out before you can even appreciate where it's coming from. And very often these again are playful uses of language and other semiotic forms, where the language play involves saying, I'm going to take this bit of language and make it my own, put my own spin on it as a way sometimes to spoof or satirize the side that you are opposing. Again, Bakhtin is very helpful for understanding these things, where he talks about like carnivalesque inversions of where, you could take official language and give it a kind of unofficial meaning. And again, like I was talking about the subversive wordplay in Indonesia that I wrote about in grad school, that was sort of very useful in thinking about those things. But very, very often it requires just kind of like, um, you know, a broader view of how these things work in our landscape of political language. And, very often that can be very, very complicated. So I see my role as kind of helping to unpack that in a way that, again, becomes more legible for people to understand exactly how these, forces work in terms of creating the various sort of cultural environments that allow for the kind of innovations to happen. And again, it can be just people, playing with language, but calling it language play may make it sound frivolous when in fact it can have very kind of profound political ramifications and how you are playing with those languages and like we were saying, can become emblematic of an entire political group just in the way that you are playing with language in a certain way, sort of taking signifiers and re-signifying them.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I mean that sometimes is a bit too nuanced to explain in an appearance on a TV show or radio show or podcast. But I do try to pick apart
Yeah.
these things and just uh, really sort of get into the complexity of how much can go into something like that, rather than again as just sort of like thinking of these things as buzzwords or things that sort of like come into our consciousness because we're hearing them from political candidates or what have you. It's sort of again sort of thinking more seriously about where all of this comes from.
Yeah. 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 For sure. For sure. I mean, I love all of what you said. I kind of wanted to ask more on this political line. So the word of the year in 2022 was ussy, this
Hmm.
suffix libfix, which annoys me to no end as a living, breathing human woman in this world who considers herself a feminist, because people are obsessed with
Hmm.
the fact that this ussy, this like comes from pussy, subtext libfix is the word of the year. And no one else previously or afterwards cares about the word of the year. No one is like, oh, enshittification is the word of the year. Ben Zimmer, please explain this to us. And I'm gonna laugh and like be in the corner, like laughing my eyes off, because it's like, why do you
Right.
care so much that ussy was word of the year, right? And I think that I've also been a little bit upset in the way that it's been defined as like, oh, you can just take it and add it to something else to like make draw attention to like if something has a hole. Well, it's not just a hole. Like we're
Hmm.
not just taking throat and ussy and making thrissy and talking about, like, no one's referring to their throat as thrissy in all contexts. That's
Sure.
only being referred to as thrissy in contexts that are sexual. No one's like,
Hmm.
oh my God, I have a cold this week, my thrissy hurts. Like that's not something that you could say felicitously. You could make a joke about blowjobs and say something about thrissy. So I don't know. This
Yeah.
you really got a lot of airtime out of ussy, which like good
Well,
for you, great.
not in not
Yeah,
on CNN, that's for sure, or
I'm
in the New
sure. Yeah,
York Times. The I it's funny because this most recent year when we picked enshittification, there was a New York Times reporter on the scene who ended up writing a very nice kind of recap of the whole thing. Did a great job with it. Her name is Sam Corbin. And I have to give major props to Sam because she managed to convince her editors to actually have enshittification unexpurgated in the
yeah,
pages of the New York Times, and that's good to see. It tells us something about sort of the changing nature of some of these taboos. The year before that, as you say, it was ussy, which I learned from Sam was something that the Times had been considering covering, but they kind of shied away from it. They're like,
right.
we're
How
going to give
dare
this a
we? How
pass.
dare we speak about that? Yeah, yeah.
Right. That was seen as off limits. That was seen as too taboo uh, for the New York Times, or I should say, the Wall Street Journal, where I write. I wasn't about to write a column about it without recognizing I would get sort of major pushback from my editors. I mean, these are the kind of strictures that we work with in major media publications. But so with ussy, it was interesting because uh, we chose ussy. I tweeted it out as I do every year on the American Dialect Society Twitter. It was still Twitter at the time, Twitter account,
Yeah,
linking to the press release, totally mild-mannered thing, and that went more viral than anything that I will ever be involved in. And in part, sort of thinking back on that more than a year later, um, why was there so much interest? Why was it this thing that just like zillions of people were sort of sharing and laughing about? Uh, in part, I think it was the fact that there is this group of language scholars, called the American Dialect Society. And of course, they don't know, also it was the Linguistic Society of America, the larger group meeting in conjunction with its sister society, the American Dialect Society. But these serious linguists and language scholars who had decided that ussy would be the word of the year was this kind of comical mismatch of a sort. It was sort of the incongruity of it, I think, is what made it humorous. That this term again, which when it's sort of getting used online and less so these days than it was a year or two ago, but
yeah.
but it is, as you say, very often, the sexual connotations, the taboo nature of it that that has to do with women's bodies, but in this particular way that
Hypersexualized, I would say.
yeah, there's a sexualization that goes on, but where the idea that you can sort of sexualize anything
Yes,
that you are sort of morphologically attaching the ussy libfix, as
right,
to use Arnold Zwicky's term, to whatever you want to, and thereby sexualizing it in this particular way.
right.
Um, that phenomenon on its own was funny enough to people. Again, you can sort of like, why is it funny? But then the idea that it has this somehow official recognition as word of the year made it seem, for a lot of people who were already familiar with the term, thought that it was hilarious that this outrageous bit of the language was getting some sort of like being anointed in this official way by a group of serious language scholars. That was the sense that I got. And then, even though the New York Times wouldn't write about it, Rolling Stone and other outlets did, ones that, where you could actually get away with talking about these things. And I saw it as an opportunity to sort of again talk about how these things do become so prominent that a group of language scholars would call it their word of the year, um, and also to talk about our whole process and how we do it. So Kelly Elizabeth Wright, who has taken on an important role in these word of the year selection processes now. We call her our data czar because she takes in the nominations from the public and then sort of presents them when we have our nominating session to talk about, what is sort of interesting people at large and like the way that the folks who are voting can understand it. She had been sort of tracking the use of ussy and seeing that people nominating it and that sort of thing. And she had created for that year a whole, video talking about the nominations. This was because she wasn't able to attend that year. The LSA conference was a video that we shared at the nominating session, but then just had online on YouTube. And so because of the exposure from, the whole to do over ussy, we sort of get this coverage in Rolling Stone, and they, even embed Kelly's video that she did where she's talking about this whole process. So like, even though for the most part, yeah, the whole thing sort of went viral in this way that kind of faded away very quickly. It didn't necessarily bring in, a huge amount of like people sort of thinking about these things in a serious way.
Yeah.
I do appreciate that was an opportunity to sort of put this out a little bit more in venues like Rolling Stone that were willing to sort of like see it originally as, oh, this is very funny, but then what the heck is the story behind this? And then sort of to look into this a bit more and report it out. I appreciated that. So yeah, the whole thing was a very kind of bizarre experience for me personally, because of course I'm the one who asked to write the press release and be out there talking about things. I'm very thankful that, Kelly Wright is also, helping out on that front with sort of dealing with media now and sort of talking about these things. But then again, sort of that whole process of the media pickup of Word of the Year has been there since the beginning, and now it's different now than it used to be back when Ellen Metcalf started running this in 1990.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I just want to clarify. It's like, it's not that ussy is the word of the year that's so upsetting. It's like the fact that people either refuse to acknowledge it, didn't want to talk about it because how dare we
Hmm.
speak about women's bodies in that way. But then
Right,
also this idea that like we can, it's just about if something has a hole, a wine bottle, a
right.
wussy or something. No, that's not what's going on here, right? You're consistently reducing like a woman's body to something that you can fuck. Like that
Mm,
is what is going on here. If the word of the year were phallic, no one would, there would, New York Times would run with, I think they would run with that. That would be so awesome because we have such a veneration of like phallicness in this world, frankly. So like that is why I think it is like at least was upsetting to me. I
yeah.
was like, really? And then to have people be like, we can't have cunty be a word of the year. Well, like, why
Mm,
not? That actually is something that people are using to be empowered, to speak
hmm.
about something as it's cunty, as in it's like powerful and it's loud and it's out there and it's
Yeah.
unapologetic. And so, yeah, that's my little,
Well,
yeah.
again, I I just you know, as a dude, I'm not going to sort of weigh in any sort of mansplainy way on these issues, and I again try to avoid that as much as possible. Even though again I'm called upon to explain things, in the case of like OC for Word of the Year, but I do try to, when these types of discussions are coming up, uh, try to inject some sanity into the discussion, but also to direct, say, reporters who want to talk about these things to people who I think would be, again, sort of better equipped to, to talk about the types of issues that you're talking about. I I'm glad that again that the Word of the Year is a kind of a forum that allows for the sort of the free exchange of all sorts of different
Yeah.
viewpoints on these things and really interesting discussions, really interesting debates. We, certainly had a lot of this most recent time, whether it was about cunty or other terms. Again, the political stuff became pretty charged as well.
Yeah.
Um, so, but I mean, it all goes to what I was saying all along. It's like you can't just sort of think of these words and phrases as just items of the lexicon. I mean, it just sounds so sterile. I mean, the way that we can invest so much cultural power into these things and how wrapped up it can get into, again, issues of identity, issues of gender and race, ethnicity, and political sexual orientation. I mean, just the gamut of things and how just the discussion of these terms can lead sometimes to hurt feelings again, or I'm constantly amazed, even just from something like Word of the Year, which was again designed by Alan Metcalf to be just something kind of a fun thing that the American Dialect Society does to draw attention to what the society's scholarship, and get some media buzz in the same way that Time does its Person of the Year. And what it's kind of grown into, and where you get, hundreds of people together and talking about these things, and again, sort of trying in the space of just a couple of hours to cover all sorts of these sort of new discursive formations and get into all of these, often very serious issues of identity and uh, and what these words and phrases mean to different people. Yeah, it's fascinating. And I mean, I take what you were saying about cunty, that obviously was expressed. There is a video that if you go to the American Dialect Society's YouTube channel, Grant Barrett put up a video. It's we didn't have cameras or whatever. We just had sort of Grant's phone, where he was like, had the podium with me and Kelly Wright and Jesse Greaser, but then mostly it's just Grant, who sort of types out the the nominations and gives his own little snarky commentary on it. But the audio, at least, you can hear everybody chiming in and talking about these words,
Yeah.
and yeah, at times it got serious. I mean, it's like tonally, I think it's is what interests me, is that we can take this Word of the Year event, which feels fun. It's something I'm glad that people want to come to it. Like lots of young scholars who are attending the LSA conference. This is like appointment, it's not appoint, it's something that they really want to go to. And then,
Yeah.
it's followed by 5 Minute Linguist, which is also kind of a fun event that everybody can join in on at the LSA. I'm glad that it has that appeal. At the same time, yeah, I mean, it's something people, it is both fun and serious at the same time, and I appreciate that the kind of the seriousness that people can bring to it at the same time that they're having fun with it.
Yeah, I mean, I just talk about when things got really like sort of more serious. I mean, the word context, right? If we think of the word
Right.
context as being somehow associated, which I don't totally agree with, the hearings with the Harvard and MIT and UPenn presidents
Right.
around Israel-Palestine conflict,
Hmm.
student protests and stuff, that got intense just because like there's a lot to be said there of the fact that when we make something the word of the year in whatever category, we're
Yeah,
crystallizing that, we're concretizing that into like
for sure.
somehow signifying something about whatever we are saying it signifies. And
Yeah.
yeah, people disagree and there's disagreement to be had. I mean, yeah, it is a fun. I mean, I think a lot of people there show up drunk, to be candid.
That's fine too. That's fine too.
Um, but yeah, I mean, it's certainly a fun situation. Um, Ben Zimmer, would love to know what your favorite word is and why.
My favorite word. Oh, that's that's funny. I do I have a favorite word? It's trying to choose among your children or
Don't you
whatever.
only have
I
one?
don't.
Wait.
No, I only have one actual child, yes.
So you
I'm
can
just
choose
saying.
among your children. You only have one. What?
No, no, no. It's funny. It's like as a kid, sort of growing up with my head buried in unabridged dictionaries, the words that appealed to me when I was youngest were the ones that were just so outrageous that you're like, why do we even have a word for that? And so, obviously those aren't ones that I necessarily care about now. But just as an example, a word that appears in one particular unabridged dictionary that I spent a lot of time paging through, Webster's New International Second Edition, the one that came
Yeah.
out in the 1930s, had all of these words that they ended up taking out in future editions. And one of them was ucalagon, ucalegon, which means a neighbor whose house is on fire. And just the specificity of that, I mean, again, you could sort of, it has to do with some Greek myth or whatever, but just the idea that there exists a word for when you need it, when your neighbor's house is on fire, that you would be able to be able to use, just really appealed to me. And so for a long time, I would just say, if I was asked that, just like, okay, Lagan.
Yeah.
But you know, I just from week to week, I feel like I get a new favorite. And so uh as we're recording this, my word of the week for the Wall Street Journal is a word that is my new current favorite, at least, until the next one comes along. And that is Herkel Durkel. Have you encountered Herkel
I
Durkel?
have not encountered Turkle Durkle. Please enlighten.
Okay, well, as Herkel Durkel is an old Scottish term that's in Scottish dictionaries from the early 19th century. It's a dialectal term just from Fife, just this one particular part of Eastern Scotland. And it basically means it can be a noun or a verb, but as a verb, it means to lie around in bed when you're supposed to get up.
Mm-hmm.
And this particular term has now become one of the trendy words of 2024. And it's a delightful word, of course, Herkel but how in the world is Herkel now being used on TikTok and other social media? How did we get to this point? And so this is the type of fun story that I get to trace in my column. This word again is only in dictionaries of the Scots language and Scottish sources, but there's a British lexicographer named Susie Dent who is a bit of a celebrity. She's a real celebrity in the UK, in large part because she's for many years has appeared on a popular quiz show, a game show called Countdown,
Mm-hmm.
where she presides over Dictionary Corner, and basically does rulings on, the contestants have to form words, and she says whether they're valid dictionary worthy words.
Yeah.
And so everybody in the UK knows Susie Dent, and she sort of parlayed that celebrity she does into like a hefty social media presence. She's got like 1 million followers on Twitter/X, and she enjoys kind of like reviving old words that, like why aren't we using this old word anymore? And she often does like a word of the day. And Herkel Durkel is just one of her favorite words, and she's sort of shared that word in the past. And it just so happened that something that she tweeted out in 2016 about how wonderful this word is, and sort of the joy of Herkel Durkeling, using this 200-year-old Scottish word, then got picked up where people would sort of take the text of what she said on Twitter and create an image with the text of that, and happiness is Herkel Durkeling and that sort of thing. And then that got shared on Instagram, Facebook, and so forth. And that caught the eye of a young uh, star named an actor/singer. Her name is Kira Kosarin, and she, Gen Z folks, I guess, would know her from her Nickelodeon show, The Thundermans, and she's now in a movie based on that. She has millions and millions. I think like 30 million followers on TikTok, and she's a hardcore word nerd. And
Mm-hmm.
so when she saw Herkel Durkel, she loved it, and she did her own TikTok on it, and talking about how everybody loves a Herkel Durkel, and why this is so applicable to everybody's lives.
Yeah.
And so now you get like, it's gotten to the point where there are think pieces in Huffington Post because they always want to sort of like keep track of the latest TikTok trends and saying, oh, Herkel Durkling is the new TikTok trend, but should you be, careful? Should you, worry about how much you Herkel Durkel? And just because you give this funny word to something, you don't want to overdo it. And there are all these other terms that people use for lying in bed, like on the weekend or whatever. Like bed rotting is this other term, which is a lot less interesting or a lot less fun to say, let's say, than
I would
Herkel
say
Durkling.
aesthetically appealing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So so that's my favorite word of the moment, just because it's like it's just the idea that this obsolete dialectal Scottish term, which granted is very fun to say, it's got rhyming reduplication. I mean, and it's just a great word. And
Yeah.
Susie Dent really sort of picked up on one that she knew that people would enjoy just because there's a kind of a pleasure in saying it, and it kind of gives you license to appreciate this thing which that everybody can again appreciate, like why not just sort of lie in bed a little longer when you're supposed to get up. So it ties into this very relatable experience. It has this funny, this funny thing. People like the idea. It's like, oh, there's a word for this thing, right?
Right.
And this particular, practice or whatever that that's more interesting than saying, lying in bed when you're supposed to get up or some longer phrase like that. Um,
Metaphysics.
right. So there's a word for it. People like to hear that. They like to know. Again, it's very often how people sort of like appeal to the dictionary in order to sort of say, this is something that isn't in the dictionary, and therefore, it's something that has some legitimacy to it. So the idea that there is a word out there, even though it's this word that comes from a couple centuries ago from Fife,
Mm.
is something that like I'm just fascinated that the way that language can travel again through one particular lexical item, the kind of the journey that it's been on and how it can be reinvented and rediscovered. Um, it's just I know that I will never run out of things to write about. When I see something like that, I see,
Yeah.
oh, Urkel Durkel is big. It's like, why? Oh, okay. And so whether it's new words coming to the language, like we talked about rizz, or whether it's a revival of some older form,
Mhm.
people are always going to um, innovate. They're always going to sort of create new things, find new semantic pathways for these things, and it keeps me in business. That's all I have to say.
That's okay. I want to point out a couple of things. Number one, like giving us license. You said like giving us license to talk about something when something's lexicalized and like
Uh-huh.
popularized, that kind of gives us license to talk about something. I think that's like such an interesting way of thinking about what words give us license. In my email to you, you during your talk in 2017 at the LSA, you kind of talked about how like um there's a new methodology by which you work, through which you work, is like I don't go out to the cafe and Starbucks and hear teenagers talk. I go to TikTok and Instagram, and because there's this guy long ago, one of the OG lexicographers, that's going down to the soda fountain to
Oh, I know
and
what you're
I
talking about.
quote watch the nubile and tight sweatered young girls.
Okay,
Um,
so that just to give some background on that, what I
yeah,
was talking about in that talk was a wonderful movie called Ball of Fire, um, which with Gary Cooper as a slang lexicographer, and obviously, just from that description, you can know why it's one of my favorite movies. And the screenwriters for that uh, wanted to have some real sort of youth slang in it. And
yeah,
this is a movie that was directed by Howard Hawks, and it was the great Billy Wilder, along with his screenwriting partner, Charles Brackett. They were the ones who, according to news accounts, when they were promoting this movie, they supposedly went down to the local malt shop to try to pick up on some of that language.
but
Now,
specifically the nubile and tight sweatered young girl
right. Okay.
language.
That, yes. So that was all in there at a time when, like, the malt shop was, I guess, there was a particular image of a particular type of usually, young woman or high school girl who you would find there. And in fact, like Lana Turner, that's her whole origin story, is she was
Oh,
discovered in a malt shop when she was, you know, sitting there just so there was
I
this
mean,
kind of
Charlize
popular
Theron,
popular
Jennifer Lawrence, yeah.
this popular image of that's where sort of like young folks hang out and might sling their slang, right? um but as I talked about at the time, that was sort of like the way that this movie was promoted by Samuel Goldwyn, who was sort of famous for promoting things in a way, so that what was being described as what the screenwriters did in search of new slang is what Gary Cooper's character does in the movie. He's the one going to the racetrack, going to the malt shop or whatever, and he ends up watching this burlesque show starring Barbara Stanwyck, who becomes the love interest, obviously, as Sugar Puss O'Shea. And so the story that they gave for how they found this language, mirrored very closely, like, the plot of the movie. So you have to take it all with a grain of salt. Anyway, that I found as a sort of very interesting thing, because some of the terms that they used in Ball of Fire were legitimate slang of the 1940s. Some
Yeah.
things they just made up. And it was only through kind of like going through and looking in newspaper databases about how this film was promoted that I realized they were actually making stuff up, claiming that they heard it down at the malt shop, and then trying to sort of like circulate these terms that had not actually existed in youth slang before. So that's a sort of a fun story about that I've used in talks like the one in 2017. Um, but that if you are in search of new language, where do you go? Where do you go? And so, and there's this kind of like fictionalized thing in Ball of Fire, which does again sort of be like, kind of tells you like what would field work consist of, if you were looking for these things, and where are the places you would go. And again, like, there are places where maybe disreputable people spend their time, like the racetrack, or where young people hang out, like the malt shop, and these various places that are thought of as like the breeding ground for new language.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, in terms of that type of uh, field work, one of course could still do that in all sorts of various ways these days. But the amount of uh, innovative language that's available to us simply by looking at Twitter/X and you know TikTok and everything else that we've been discussing, um, makes it simultaneously much easier and much more difficult for word watchers such as myself, because again, we've got so much at that we don't have to like go in search of. We can do, if there's some particular thing that's new or a revival of something old like Herkel Durkel. It's easy enough to just sort of like search on these social media platforms to see how people are using it, where it came from. Sometimes you can get a minute by minute account of how something sort of bubbles up and then people latch onto it. And again, we were talking about sort of the political side of it. The way that whether it's uh, something like the Let's Go Brandon phenomenon or anything like
Yeah.
that. You can sort of watch how that all uh, unfolds in real time very often.
Yeah.
So that's exciting, but at the same time, it's incredibly overwhelming because there is so much. It's just like it is so daunting to even sort of think about sometimes, because it's more than one could ever handle, and there's just so much coming in. And again, I sort of think about that whenever we get sort of the Word of the Year nominations coming in. It's like I certainly, as one person, cannot keep up with all of these things that people are sending in or saying that this is something that was sort of prominent or that I noticed. And then we could sort of retrospectively retrospectively go back and sort of fill in like where these things are coming from. But yeah, so it's it's interesting. Yeah, again, like the how social media has developed these days, and of course, there are all sorts of problems with that. The way that if you sort of focus just on that particular form of mediated language, what you're missing, right? Or sometimes, like we were talking about before, things that appear to be new because suddenly they're big on TikTok or whatever. But you just because you haven't been looking in other places where these linguistic forms may be developing. So
Yeah.
it's something that it's hard to keep up with. It's a constantly shifting landscape, but it's never boring, that's for sure.
Yeah, and yeah, as you just said, like, you go on social media, that increases the diversity of who you're like of who you're listening in on, right? Honestly.
True. Yep.
With their permission. I mean, it's public, but
Right.
that does, I mean, it's not like rapid and anonymous like back in the day. But so I mean, I think that's like that's important. Certainly it makes language, there's more to pull from, and there's it's maybe harder to figure out sort of where things originated, but certainly it increases the diversity of who you're
Yeah,
observing. Yeah.
that's key. And yeah, the diversity of voices that that you can. I mean, it's interesting too because the algorithms are set up very often
Yeah.
to just kind of show you what you want to see, right? And that's been so much that's been written about, algorithms on whether it's, TikTok or Instagram or whatever. And that can have a kind of that can create a kind of like a tunnel vision, perhaps, where you're not being exposed to other voices. But the fact that they're out there, if you get sort of break out from beyond the what the algorithms are choosing to put on your For You page or what have you, um, is really key. And yeah, it means that the documentation of language change can encompass a lot more diversity where again that might have been difficult to get a handle on before. So that's important. But yeah, like I said, I mean, because sometimes there's this sort of siloing effect, where you're
Mhm.
just, your profile has been determined by the algorithm, and that's what you're going to see. Um, that kind of the sort of limitations on the consumption of that media, you have to kind of be aware of that as well. Even at the same time, you feel like there's this vast landscape that, and if you're looking for things, you can find it, although you can't necessarily always find it, as we discovered when we did the installment on algo speak for Among the New Words. Really successful algo speak is going to be hard for even us to find because the whole point is like very often you're trying to make it not something you can search for. You can
Yeah.
still search for say a watermelon emoji. The various platforms allow you
Yeah.
to search on emoji, for instance, but there are other types of things where you may be sort of coming up with something that is evading people searching for it, and that obviously is something that we have to be aware of because what's available to us and what's sort of legible for us to even talk about and when we're documenting these things are things that we can search for, right? So that's something I think about a lot too in terms of just the work I do, even for writing the Wall Street Journal column. One reason I feel like I can tell stories about any particular word or phrase is because I can search for them now in a kind of targeted searching on databases of newspapers and books and magazines and so forth, in a way that is, now possible to do rather than just being like, well, the Oxford English Dictionary says such and such. And now it
Mhm.
can be like, well, back in the 1920s, this sports writer was using all sorts of like funny expressions, and this got picked up in a comic strip, and blah blah blah. And very often it's those kind of like pop culture type sources like that, where language that is new and innovative is allowed to thrive. And perhaps before, 100 years ago, that would have been sports writers and comic strip artists who were the ones who were doing it. Now, of course, that extends to everyone basically has the ability to sort of like put that creative and innovative language out there in the world. But I often think too, though, it's like I'm able to create these stories based on the fact that I am able to search for them, and that's a certain kind of legibility that works only for searchable words and phrases, and
Yeah.
that obviously not that doesn't encompass all of what language does. And it does get back to sort of what I was saying before, the kind of lexicocentric approach that I realize that I'm taking, but I try to be aware of in terms of like, this is one particular lens for language, even if it's not the whole linguistic picture.
Yeah, yeah, but at least you don't specifically tell the world that you're allowed to call people nubile and tight sweatered
Oh,
and watch
yeah.
them at the soda fountain.
No, yeah, those days are long gone.
Right, exactly, because we don't have a license to say that. That's right. So Ben Zimmer, first off, thank you so much for joining me today. My last question for you is why linguistics? Why language? Interpret this however you like. But I always think it's fun to know.
Sure. I mean, it's funny. I mean, when I think back to again being a linguistics major undergrad, it's sort of, I mean, what appealed to me is always just sort of like how this thing that we all may sort of take for granted has this kind of hidden structure to it. I mean, again, that's like, even though I got away from formal linguistics, the idea of the idea of just, like when you take your syntax class and you start talking about, uh, from the generative approach, you start
Yeah.
talking about, deep structures and surface structures, and you start thinking it's like, oh, this whole machinery that nobody even thinks about, and they somehow just learn it when they're young. It's like, this miraculous thing that happens with every person who learns language or languages, in the case of bilingual, multilingual people, and um and again, even if I sort of, as a young person, sort of thought of it as just like words in a dictionary, and that's something that I've returned to in sort of the things I do more lexicographically. Just the whole picture of what language does just fascinates me to no end. And I've been lucky to kind of have mentors along the way who have kind of, fostered this in a way. So, when I got to University of Chicago, my my advisor is Michael Silverstein, and
Wow.
all of the
Congratulations.
all of the all of the sort of theoretical underpinnings we were talking about, again, it's like it's the sort of the Silversteinian approach to be like, yes, we're going to, in his famous language in culture class, we're going to talk about Saussure, we're going to talk about Bloomfield and these whole traditions, but we're also going to, bring in all of these other things like Bakhtin, for instance. I mean, that's what I owe it all to. And something that Michael Silverstein talked about was, he called it at one time the total linguistic fact. And basically that encompasses, the structure or form, the use of language. So, if you know Saussure, it's like, langue and parole or whatever, but we're talking about structure as well. It's like the pragmatics of use. And then the ideology, the way that all of this is mediated by cultural ideology, and how you can't just treat any of these things in isolation. It is the total linguistic fact. You have to sort of think about it holistically, and that also means bringing in all of these kind of theoretical approaches that help you get a handle on these things. And again, whether it's Bakhtin or uh, you know uh,
Purse.
semiotics from
Yeah,
Peirce,
I
exactly,
think, yeah,
which
purse is like
which
the most
right,
important.
exactly.
Yeah.
Right. So the whole idea that Silverstein developed of indexicality comes from him learning about Peirce from Roman Jakobson, was a teacher of his at Harvard. And, so I feel very lucky
Oh,
to have been
yeah.
able to kind of experience that. And even though I didn't stay in academia, it still, like I said, kind of informs my thinking about language and keeps me uh, always kind of trying to remain intellectually open in terms
Yeah.
of, again, different approaches to language that you can take. And sadly, Michael Silverstein passed away in the summer of 2020, and it was a tough time. Summer of 2020 obviously was a tough time for other reasons, but Michael Silverstein passed away that July, and the following month, Jeff Nunberg passed away, and uh, uh, they both died of like the same thing, actually, glioblastoma, that's sort of aggressive form of brain cancer. But I still think of them as my kind of like my guiding lights, because Silverstein, certainly from the academic portion of my career, and um, and Jeff Nunberg for trying to make my way as a kind of a public intellectual and language commentator, and the path that he set in doing that. We were talking about politics of language. I mean, again, whenever I'm getting into sort of the political terrain and stuff that I'm writing about or talking about, I think about, well, how would Jeff Nunberg talk about this? And he gave me so much guidance in terms of like trying to bring all of these sometimes arcane linguistic topics to a general audience, how to make it accessible and understandable, and have some
Yeah.
flair in the process of doing it, and really do it. So anyway, when I think about language and linguistics, think about I think about folks like Michael Silverstein and Jeff Nunberg, who have given me the tools to talk about these things, and hopefully I can inspire people to do the same. So yeah, it motivates me and keeps me always wanting to discover new things and staying open intellectually.
Yeah, I love that. Like, I genuinely, like, you have no idea how much that answer, how like amazing I think that was. I mean, I think that's the first time someone's like invoked like all of those names in one answer before. I mean, certainly you talked before about like the total linguistic fact and how you really
Yeah,
you can't silo any aspect of language. That for me, it's
right.
just been so important to think about is like, I'm so glad that I do literary theory. I'm so glad that I read Peirce so much because
Hmm.
that like that's what language does, right? Because
Exactly.
as much as we know about what Saussure taught us or what Chomsky taught us, what we just already know and just being aware of what it does and what it affects and what it signifies and what it indexes first and second and thirdness, as we know,
Hmm.
is so important.
Yeah,
So
and
to make so yeah.
it's great. It's great though too that those concepts have been embraced, in anthropology departments by linguistic anthropologists, but also in linguistics departments. And sociolinguistics is very much informed by all of that now.
Yeah.
And again, yeah, just sort of being able to have uh, be steeped in all of that through my academic training is something that I will always treasure. And again, like I'm not in academia, but I think that these are valuable concepts and approaches to language that can be taken outside of academia to the type of work that I do. And so yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
Cool.
Anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I just can't tell you how much that answer like really means. I mean, yeah, to think of language in all of its parts, but
Right.
really give credence to enregisterment and indexicality
Hmm.
and the political nature of it. And by doing so, then you give credence to like the technicalities of prosody and things like that. But to
That's
sort
right.
of,
You
yeah,
don't, yeah, you don't ignore any of it. That's what I learned. And that in a sense is a problem with linguistics, with a capital L,
yes,
that
yes,
that is just sort of like trading, again, the Lang of Lang and Perot, for instance, and
yeah,
and not
yeah,
even, let alone the sort of the ideological part of it and the metalinguistic metapragmatics, as Silverstein would say.
yeah,
Um, but yeah, you have to sort of widen your lens and think about these things in their totality and holistically to really
yeah. I
appreciate.
think that's what linguistic anthropology gives us in ways that
Yeah.
I'm so grateful for. I mean, I am a sociolinguist slash person of that nature. So I really honestly don't care too much for like the real technicalities of the capital L semantics, linguistics situations. But I think that it's great that linguistic anthropology does exist. I wish it were more embraced. I mean, I think like just in general
Hmm.
in academia, I mean, for departments and everything, there's a tendency to want to silo things, and
Yeah.
that can be tricky. But I don't know. Yeah, yeah, that's yeah, I love linguistic anthropology. Anyway, Ben Zimmer, thank you so much for joining me today. It's really been a privilege to have you here.
Oh, well, this has been so much fun. Thank you for having me on.